I recently lived through what can only be described as my personal nightmare, something out of a suburban horror story. The president of our HOA, Karen, and her overgrown man-child of a husband took it upon themselves to chainsaw through a majestic, 30-year-old oak tree, one that had stood like a sentinel at the edge of our property for decades, just so their so-called private beach, on shared community land, mind you, could bask in a little more sunlight. And their excuse? They called it a minor visual correction, as if the destruction of natural beauty could be brushed off like smudges on a window. But the only thing that got visually corrected that day was their precious lake view, which I replaced with a glorious 6-foot wall of solid metal, permitted, reinforced, and completely obstructive. But let's rewind for a second. To understand how we got here, you need to know something about me. I've got a temper. I don't wear it proudly, but it's there, simmering just under the surface like an ember waiting to catch. My wife Amanda calls it my fire. She says it's what makes me protective, loyal, and unwilling to back down. I think she's just being generous. Most of the time, it just gets me into trouble. But this time, my fire was exactly what the situation called for. It all began on a Saturday morning, the kind of peaceful, postcard-perfect morning that makes you fall in love with lakefront living. The air was crisp, the coffee was steaming, and the lake shimmered like a mirror. Amanda and I were soaking in the quiet from our back deck when an ugly, high-pitched whine split the calm like a buzzsaw through bone. I followed the sound to the border of our property, a sliver of shared green space that sloped down to the water, dotted with a couple of grand old oaks, and what I saw made my coffee curdle. Two men, clearly hired hands, were hacking down one of the oaks. Not trimming, not shaping, flat out erasing it from existence. That tree, a living monument that shaded half the block, was being shredded like junk mail. I walked to the edge of my yard in stunned silence, staring at the gaping wound left behind. I didn't say a word, didn't need to. The silence had a pressure to it, like the split second before a building implodes. Amanda knew the look on my face too well. Without missing a beat, she handed me my coffee and muttered, "Don't bury the body until after lunch." And there she was, Karen, standing off to the side with her arms folded and a smirk so smug it could wrinkle glass. She ran the neighborhood, like a personal fiefdom, ruling over us all with passive-aggressive memos and HOA violations. Beside her stood Bob, her perpetually disgruntled husband, clipboard in hand, looking like he'd just sniffed spoiled milk and pretending he was supervising the next phase of some master plan. And there he was, Kevin, lounging like royalty, in a brand new patio chair, drink in hand, sipping straight from a coconut like he was on some luxury island vacation instead of a hijacked strip of community land. Kevin was 25 going on 12, a man-child with zero responsibilities and even less self-awareness, and he was the reason that beautiful oak was being murdered. My feet felt like they weighed 100 pounds each as I marched across the grass, barely, containing the pressure rising in my chest. "Karen, what is going on here?" I asked, really trying, to keep my voice level. She turned around with a smile so plastic it should have had a barcode. "Oh, hello, Jack," she chirped. Sweetly, "We're just making some improvements. Kevin needs a little more sun for his beach area." Her beach area, on shared land. I glanced around and felt my stomach twist. Sawdust was everywhere, like confetti at a crime scene, and a fresh pile of beer cans had already formed beside Kevin's throne. "This is community property, Karen," I said, my tone sharpening despite myself. "You can't just cut down trees and build your son his own private beach." That's when Bob waddled forward, puffing himself up like he'd been waiting for this moment all his life. He tapped his clipboard with theatrical flair. "Actually, we can," he declared. "The HOA Architectural Committee, of which I'm the chair, has approved the beautification of this plot. It's been reassigned for private use." He said reassigned, like it was a spell that erased all reason. Kevin, meanwhile, lifted his drink and gave me a lazy wave, his smirk practically daring me to do something. My fists curled up involuntarily, the fire in me now flickering hot. Amanda, ever the calm in my storm, appeared behind me and placed a gentle hand on my arm, a silent reminder to breathe. "You didn't notify any of the homeowners," she said in her calm, measured tone. "Especially not us. And this affects our property directly." Karen rolled her eyes and dismissed her concern with a flick of the wrist, like Amanda had asked for extra napkins. It was a minor administrative change, she said. No vote was needed. It's done. Then, as always, she spun around and tried to walk away like the conversation and any consequences were beneath her. That was her signature move, drop the bomb and vanish. But not this time. Not today. I stepped forward, heart pounding in my ears, and said one word. No. The word came out louder than I intended, sharp, final, and laced with fire. No, the chainsaw stopped mid-whine, the sudden silence crashing down like a hammer. Every head turned toward me. No, it is not done, I repeated, stepping forward until I was toe-to-toe with Bob, who instinctively shuffled back like a balloon losing air. You have 72 hours to stop this nonsense, I said, my voice steady but simmering. Remove the junk, cancel whatever fake reassignment you think gives you authority, and restore that land before I do it myself. Karen whirled around, eyes narrowed to venomous slits. Is that a threat? She hissed. I gave her a smile, cold, controlled, and entirely without humor. No, I said. It's a promise. You have 72 hours. Kevin snorted into his ridiculous coconut drink like it was all some sitcom. Bob's lips thinned into an angry line, and Karen looked at me, like I was something she scraped off her designer shoes. Then, with a sharp little laugh, she scoffed, You have no power here, and turned to the workers. Keep going. Amanda, always the one who kept me tethered, slipped her hand around my arm and gently pulled me away. Let's go, Jack. Not here. Not now. She was right. Exploding in the middle of our yard wouldn't fix a thing. It would only make me look unhinged and give them the upper hand. But as we walked back toward our house, the saw whirred to life again. It's mechanical. Screamed digging into my spine like a taunt. That sound, along with their smug faces, burned into my memory. They thought they could walk all over me. They thought I was just another passive neighbor they could bully into silence with paperwork and arrogance. What they didn't know was that I'm not just a guy with a temper. I'm a contracts lawyer. I deal in bylaws, codes, zoning restrictions, and the kind of red tape that strangles people who don't read the fine print. And let me tell you, they hadn't read a single word. They had 72 hours. And while their smug little kingdom of beach chairs and beer cans baked in the sun, I was already crafting their reckoning. They wanted to steal my peace. Fine. I was going to build a monument to my fury, right on the edge of my property line, something so perfectly legal, permanent, and irritating they'd be forced to see it every single day. They thought they'd won. But what they really did was start a war. And I was already preparing for battle. They thought it was over, that I'd huff and puff and eventually fade into the background like every other homeowner they pushed around. But I knew this was only the beginning. We bought our house on Lakeview Drive because it was supposed to be our escape, our sanctuary from the chaos of city life. The constant noise, the traffic, the feeling of being packed into a concrete box, it all wore us down. I make a solid living as a contracts lawyer, and Amanda, with her eye for detail and design, has built a career as a brilliant graphic designer. Together, we had saved for years to afford this slice of serenity, a home with a sprawling yard, a calming view of the water, and a stillness that felt like therapy. At first, everything seemed perfect. The neighbors offered friendly waves as they walked their dogs, casual greetings as they checked their mail. It felt like a true community. And then we met the HOA, or rather, the tyrannical regime disguised as a homeowners association, lorded over by Karen. During closing, our realtor had mentioned that the HOA was very active, with a tight smile that, in hindsight, was practically a warning label. They keep the neighborhood looking pristine, he'd said, but what he should have told us was, they're a petty dictatorship obsessed with control, and they will make your life hell over the shade of your welcome mat. Our first taste of Karen's reign came about a month after we settled in. A neatly embossed cream-colored envelope arrived, adorned with the HOA's logo like it was sent from royalty. Inside, a $50 violation. Our crime. A garden hose that wasn't coiled into a perfect spiral. Not tangled, not leaking, just resting casually by the spigot. I laughed, assuming it was a joke. Amanda, ever the voice of reason, advised caution. Let's not make waves, she said. So we paid it. But it felt wrong, like slipping a bribe to a playground bully just to avoid a black eye. Weeks later, Another envelope. This time the fine was $75. The offense? An unapproved seasonal decoration. We had hung a small, tasteful wreath on our front door, something charming, welcoming. Apparently, wreaths had to be submitted for review by the HOA's architectural committee, which, surprise, surprise, was chaired by none other than Bob, Karen's clipboard-wielding husband. That's when the pattern started to reveal itself. This wasn't about community standards or curb appeal. It was about dominance, about control, about a couple drunk on their tiny thrones of power. And I was beginning to realize that if we didn't push back, they'd never stop tightening their grip. That IT was never really about beautification or order. It was about reminding everyone, every single day, that they were in charge. That's when I met Vinny, a neighbor who lived 3 houses down, and someone who'd clearly weathered this storm before. Vinny was a retired mailman with wild, wiry gray hair that looked like it had survived a tornado and stayed standing. He was always out in his yard, trimming hedges or rearranging garden gnomes, clad in an old fishing vest with so many pockets it could have doubled as a hardware store. One afternoon, he spotted me at my mailbox, staring in disbelief at the latest violation notice. He shuffled over, wiping sweat from his brow with a rag that had definitely seen better days. "Got another love letter from Queen Karen?" he rasped, his voice a gravelly whisper lined with decades of cynicism. I handed him the letter, and he didn't even flinch, just nodded knowingly. "Yeah, that's her. She fined me $100 last year because my bird bath was attracting unapproved species of birds." He looked me dead in the eye. "I ask you, how am I supposed to tell a robin it's not welcome?" That was just the beginning. Vinny had stories, ones that sounded more like a political thriller than suburban drama. Karen had been HOA president for 10 years, originally voted in after promising to lower dues. But once she had power, she and Bob rewrote the bylaws, effectively crowning themselves monarchs of Lakeview Drive. They had authority to issue fines at will, deny renovations, approve, or block any homeowner request, and even slap liens on properties. According to Vinny, they'd also funneled money into shady contracts with friends, treating the HOA budget like their personal ATM. "She's a snake," Vinny muttered, glancing around as if the trees had ears. "And her husband Bob? He's the little rat scurrying behind her, doing the dirty work." At the time, I thought maybe Vinny was exaggerating, letting old grudges paint his picture too dark. But the longer I lived there, the more I saw the cracks in the perfect facade. Vinny wasn't crazy. He was paying attention. And when they chainsawed that oak tree and laughed about it, when they carved up community land like it was theirs to gift to their spoiled son, that was it. That was the line. This wasn't about garden hoses anymore. They weren't just flexing their authority. They were physically taking what wasn't theirs and daring anyone to stop them. So when I gave Karen that 72-hour deadline, it wasn't just my temper flaring. It was the lawyer in me standing up. The one who knows how power works, how it's abused, and more importantly, how to dismantle it piece by piece. For the next 3 days, Amanda and I barely slept. We set up in my home office, surrounded by a fortress of legal documents. The thick stack of HOA bylaws, covenants, property records, and every shred of paper we'd collected since buying the house. And as we dug deeper, line by line, clause by clause, the cracks turned into fault lines. We weren't just going to fight back. We were going to expose everything that I read, every single line of those bylaws, like I was searching for buried treasure or a loaded weapon. I was looking for a loophole, a chink in their armor, anything I could use to flip the script. Amanda, with her impeccable designer's eye and a brain built for structure, transformed our office into a war room. She color-coded notes, flagged key phrases, and cross-referenced every contradiction. On the second night, hunched over the desk with tired eyes and strong coffee, she pointed to a clause tucked deep in the section on property disputes. "Look at this," she said, tapping the page. "Any barrier or fence erected must not exceed 6 feet in height and must remain within the homeowner's property lines." It doesn't say a word about what it has to be made of. That's when the grin hit my face, slow, deliberate, and soaked in vengeance. They thought they could take my view, desecrate a shared space, and leave me with sawdust and silence? Fine. I would return the favor by giving them a new view they'd never forget. They tried to steal my peace, so I was going to hand them an eyesore so aggressive it would haunt their morning coffee for years. The 72 hours were ticking down, and my promise was about to become reality. Karen strutted around like she held all the cards, but she'd forgotten one thing. You don't mess with someone who lives in the fine print. On the fourth morning, Karen, Bob, and their eternally shirtless man-child, Kevin, woke up to a whole new landscape. The lake view from their freshly bulldozed beach area? Gone. In its place stood a wall. Not just any wall. No, this was a masterpiece. I had called in a favor from a loyal construction client, and overnight, his crew worked in silence under floodlights to install a fence that was exactly 6 feet tall, the maximum height allowed by HOA regulations, and precisely 1 inch inside my property line, making it bulletproof from a legal standpoint. And the material? Oh, it was glorious. A Frankenstein quilt of mismatched, rust-streaked, corrugated metal, clashing shades of gray, dented panels, and shiny scrap pieces that shimmered like an insult in the sun. It was loud without making a sound, ugly in a way that couldn't be ignored. It was my art, my personal, hideous monument to resistance. I was sipping coffee on my deck when the show began. Karen's scream rang out across the lawn, a perfect soprano note of unfiltered outrage. She came storming out, Bob shuffling behind her, red-faced and blinking like he'd just been slapped by God himself. They stopped at the edge of their now useless party zone, staring at the metallic monstrosity that split their kingdom in half. Kevin's brand new jet ski ramp? Completely blocked. Their precious view of the lake? Obliterated. All that remained was my wall, a jagged, shimmering symbol of their defeat. I lifted my coffee in a silent toast and gave them a small wave over the top. Karen's face turned a shade of purple that defied nature. Her finger trembled as she pointed straight at me and screamed, "You will take this down. You will. Take this down right now." Karen screamed, her voice cracking with fury as she jabbed a trembling finger toward the fence. I didn't even flinch, just took a slow, satisfied sip of my coffee and called back. "It's on my property, Karen, and it meets every single HOA regulation." I checked. Bob was already flipping through his sacred copy of the bylaws like a televangelist hunting for a verse to justify a tantrum. But there was nothing there, because I had followed their own ridiculous rules to the letter. An hour later, as expected, a police car rolled up the street. Karen had clearly called the cavalry, probably claiming I'd built a medieval fortress or declared sovereign independence. A weary-looking officer stepped out, clipboard in hand, and calmly walked over. I handed him the property survey, clearly marked, notarized, and indisputably in my favor. I handed him a printed copy of the HOA bylaws, already highlighted for his convenience. He took his time, walked the property line, eyed the fence, then headed over to Karen, who was waiting like a queen expecting vindication. I couldn't hear what he said, but I saw the show. Karen waving her arms wildly, stomping like a toddler in heels, while the officer simply shook his head, turned around, and drove away. That silence. That was the sound of victory. But I knew, better than to get comfortable. Karen wasn't the type to go quietly. If she couldn't beat me with the rules, she'd try to bury me in paperwork and threats. And sure enough, a few days later, the next missile arrived, not in one of her dainty cream-colored envelopes, but in an official letterhead from the HOA's attorney. A fine for $10,000. The charge? Creating a hostile and unsightly environment. I nearly choked on my coffee laughing. It was so absurd it read like satire. 10 grand for an ugly, legal fence on my land. The letter was full of legal threats. Bolded warnings about liens, property seizures, and forced removal if I didn't pay up. It was textbook intimidation. Throw a big number at the problem and hope it folds under pressure. But they clearly forgot who they were dealing with. I wasn't just a homeowner. I was a lawyer. And now, this wasn't just a petty squabble. It was war. Personal, calculated, and long overdue. I wasn't just going to fight this fine. I was going to use it as the first brick in tearing down their entire corrupt little empire. But first, I had to address this ridiculous charge head-on. The letter said there would be an official HOA hearing in 2 weeks, where the board would vote to ratify the fine. My chance to appeal. Of course, I knew it would be a farce. The board was stacked with Karen's loyal yes-men, people who nodded when she frowned and clapped when Bob sneezed. But I wasn't going there to plead. I was going to put on a show. "The agenda, Mr. Peterson," Karen snapped, trying to cut me off with that same brittle authority she always wielded like a gavel. But I didn't stop. I didn't even blink. "It should be," I said, louder this time, letting my words carry through the room like a stone tossed into still water. "Because this fine, this hearing, this whole circus, it all started when that land was illegally repurposed for personal use by your family, without a vote, without notification, and without transparency." The room was quiet now. No more fidgeting, no more coughing. Just silence and 20 pairs of eyes watching her squirm. "According to the HOA's own bylaws," I continued, tapping the highlighted document in my folder, "any alteration to common use land requires a full community vote with 2/3 approval. That vote never happened. The reassignment was done quietly, internally, and conveniently, approved by a board you stacked with your own allies." Karen opened her mouth, but I raised my hand and kept going. "Furthermore, I've obtained copies of several financial statements from the last 3 years. These include contracts awarded to vendors with no business licenses, inflated invoices paid out to companies registered under shell accounts, accounts tied to a P.O. box registered to Bob Peterson." Bob's head snapped up, color draining from his face. His khakis now bore dark sweat patches that looked like a Rorschach test of guilt. Karen's smile was frozen in place, twitching at the corners like a marionette whose strings were fraying. "I'm submitting all of this," I said, holding up the folder, "to the County Oversight Committee, the IRS, and our local investigative journalist team, just to be thorough. I've also included a signed petition from a dozen neighbors requesting a full audit of the HOA's finances and a vote to remove the current board for gross misconduct." Karen's jaw clenched so hard I could hear her teeth grind. "You wanted to fine me 10 grand for a fence that's legal, safe, and ugly? Fine. But what's truly hostile, what's truly a blight," I pointed at her and Bob, "is a regime that abuses power, misuses community funds, and bullies residents into silence." I took a step back and scanned the room. The audience wasn't just listening, they were absorbing, processing. The doubt had started to spread like cracks in concrete. "You thought this was my trial," I said, slowly, deliberately. "You were wrong. This is yours, and court is now in session. Mr. Chun, you were fined $150 for having a non-regulation mailbox, even though it matched the ones installed by the previous builder, correct?" Mr. Chun, seated near the back, gave a slow, solemn nod. "And the Hargrove family," I continued, pulling yet another page from the folder, "received 3 separate fines totaling $600 for hanging laundry on their back deck, for planting unapproved tulips, and for having a dog bowl visible from the sidewalk. Does that sound like reasonable governance?" A low rumble of agreement passed through the room, small but growing. Karen's face was a frozen mask of panic barely hidden behind indignation. Bob was still on his feet, clenching the back of his chair like he was holding on for dear life. I held up the final page, the list of fines issued and highlighted by recipient and total amount. Now, here's the part that really caught my attention. Out of 42 fines issued over the last 2 years, 31 were directed at homeowners who either spoke out at meetings or submitted requests to dispute board decisions. Meanwhile, Karen's friends? Her inner circle? I tapped the page. 0 fines. Not one. The room was dead silent now, the tension thick as wet cement. I turned back to Karen. "So yes, let's talk about fines. Let's talk about how this HOA has weaponized them, not to enforce fairness or standards, but to punish dissent and consolidate power. You're not managing a neighborhood, Karen. You're running a petty dictatorship dressed up in landscaping guidelines and font specifications." Karen slammed both palms on the table and stood, furious. "This hearing is over," she barked. "The fine stands." But it was too late. The room had turned. I saw it in the faces of the neighbors who had once stayed silent, afraid, or indifferent. They were awake now. "You're right," I said, closing my folder. "This hearing is over, but the investigation is just beginning." I gave her a final look, calm, cold, and certain. "You abused your power. You thought no one would stand up to you. You thought you could silence us with fines and fear. But not anymore." As I stepped back and took my seat, I knew I had done more than just defend my fence. I had cracked open the door that would bring the whole rotten structure down. You were fined for your trash cans being visible from the street for 3 hours instead of the approved 2, I said, pointing toward Mr. Chin again. He nodded, arms crossed tightly, the frustration etched deep in his face. Then I turned back to the board, my voice rising with each word. And I'm being fined $10,000, not for breaking a law, not for causing harm, but for building a fence that you happen to find unsightly. I paused, letting the absurdity hang in the air. But what about Lot B7? I asked, snapping the room's attention back to Karen. What about the loud, late-night parties? The trash left scattered, all over the lawn. The illegal bonfires that violate multiple fire code ordinances? Because I've logged 17 separate violations on that little patch of land in the last 2 weeks alone. I flipped through a stack of photos and reports, time-stamped, dated, indisputable. So tell me, where are the fines for those? The room went still, the kind of silence that pulses with discomfort. Karen's face was frozen in a furious snarl, jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. But she had no answer, because there were no fines. She couldn't find her own son, and everyone in that room knew it. The hypocrisy hung in the air like the stench of something rotten. The board has made its decision about the land, Karen finally muttered through gritted teeth, forcing the conversation back into her controlled script. We are here to vote on the fine against you. She raised her hand. All in favor of upholding the $10,000 fine. Bob's hand shot up like it was spring-loaded. The 2 remaining board members, clearly trapped in the middle of a political minefield, glanced at each other, then slowly, reluctantly, raised their hands. The motion passes, Karen said, a glint of victory in her eyes. The fine stands. This hearing is over. She banged her tiny gavel on the table like a judge in a low-budget courtroom drama. She thought she had won. She thought her carefully staged performance and rubber stamp board had handed her another win. Around the room, neighbors stirred, their murmurs growing louder, grumbling, seeing for the first time how rigged the whole game really was. But they still felt powerless. Karen had the votes. She had the gavel. I had been publicly humiliated, and on paper, now owed $10,000 for daring to fight back. As I packed my folder, Bob brushed past me and leaned in close, voice dripping with smugness. Should have just taken the fence down, lawyer boy. I didn't respond with anger. I smiled, because while Karen thought the show had ended, she didn't realize this hearing was never the real fight. It was just the opening act. A chance to put her corruption on display for everyone to see. The real battle? That was happening back at my house, where Amanda, brilliant, relentless Amanda, was digging into something far more powerful than bylaws and citations. She was following the money, and she was about to hit gold. Losing this hearing wasn't a defeat. It was bait. And Karen had just walked straight into the trap that I knew I was going to lose. That was never the point. The real goal was to expose the truth, to make it undeniable that the entire game was rigged from the start. And it worked. The moment the meeting ended, my phone lit up like a Christmas tree. Calls, texts, emails from neighbors I barely even knew. People were furious, their eyes finally opened to Karen's blatant corruption. Mrs. Gable wanted to start a petition. Mr. Chun was ready to lead a full-blown protest. And even conspiracy-minded Vinny called me from his burner phone, swearing. It was the only line Karen hadn't tapped. Told you, he said. She's a crook, we gotta act. It was encouraging, sure, but deep down I knew protests and signatures wouldn't shake Karen. She'd scoff, wave it off like dust on her blazer. No, I needed to hit her with something. Real, something she couldn't dismiss, something criminal. That's where Amanda came in. While I played the outraged homeowner, she quietly transformed into a meticulous investigator. We'd somehow gotten access to the HOA's financial records, 5 years' worth of dry, dense spreadsheets and bank statements. To me, it was overwhelming noise. To Amanda, it was a pattern waiting to be cracked. Night after night she sat at our cluttered dining table, now buried in paperwork and stained coffee mugs, color-coding every line with her arsenal of highlighters. Green for landscaping, yellow for maintenance, pink for admin expenses. One evening, her voice broke the silence, focused and sharp. Jack, something's off. She slid a page toward me, her brow creased in suspicion. The landscaping budget was massive, over $100,000 a year for what? A bit of mowing and seasonal flowers? That can't be right, I muttered, eyeing the numbers. Exactly, she nodded, tapping the vendor name. Pristine Lawns, LLC. It sounded like something pulled from thin air. And come to think of it, I'd never seen a single truck bearing that name in the neighborhood. Under the cover of darkness, we became shadows, slipping through the streets and sliding dossier under the doors of our most trusted allies, the vocal homeowners, the ones who were fed up and ready for action. Dossier B stayed with me. That was my final card, the last strike reserved for Karen alone. When the meeting finally arrived, the community clubhouse was packed, standing room only. I'd never seen it so full, the air charged like a storm cloud ready to burst. People weren't there for the cookies or the punch, they came for a reckoning. At the front table sat Karen and Bob, looking smug and untouchable, like royalty presiding over their court. They had no clue what was about to hit them. Karen opened with her usual scripted nonsense about rising property values and the sacred importance of rule following. But as she droned on, I scanned the room. Homeowners were opening their folders, scanning the pages, passing them down the rows. I watched eyes go wide, watched people whisper, lean over, nod with disbelief. The fuse was lit, and I could feel the explosion coming. A low, angry buzz began to ripple through the room like a hive disturbed, and Karen, sensing the sudden shift in energy, faltered mid-sentence. Her voice grew louder, more defensive, but it was too late. The mood had turned. She tried to charge ahead, moving to the first agenda item, the annual budget. The board has approved a 5% increase in dues to cover rising costs, she announced stiffly. And that was the spark. Mr. Chin rose from his seat, holding up the thin folder we'd slipped under his door like it was evidence in a courtroom. I have a question about those rising costs, he said calmly. Can you explain the $112,000 paid last year to a company called Pristine Lawns? The room froze, and the tension was suddenly suffocating. Karen's face drained of color, and Bob scrambled to his feet. That's a board-approved vendor that provides excellent service, he barked, sweat gleaming on his forehead. What's the name of the owner of that company? Mrs. Gable called out, her voice quivering with emotion but firm as steel. Bob's mouth opened and closed, and then he stumbled over his words. That's confidential vendor information. He finally choked out. The room exploded. Homeowners were shouting, standing, waving their copies of the dossier in the air. Are you stealing from us? Whose company is it? We want answers. The chaos crescendoed. Karen slammed her gavel on the table again and again, her voice shrieking above the crowd. This is out of line. These are baseless accusations. But her voice was drowned out by fury. It was glorious, the perfect storm. My plan was unfolding with surgical precision, her authority unraveling in real time, her empire of lies collapsing around her. I stood up, heart racing, ready to deliver the knockout punch. Dossier B, the land theft, the ultimate betrayal. I opened my mouth to speak when, suddenly, the clubhouse doors burst open. 2 uniformed police officers entered, and the crowd went silent like someone had cut the power. But they weren't looking at Karen. They were looking directly at me. One officer raised a folded sheet of paper and called out, his voice echoing through the breathless room. Jack Peterson, you are under arrest for harassment and extortion. My blood turned to ice. This wasn't just unexpected, it was catastrophic. Gasps rippled through the room as every head turned toward me. The heated chaos dissolved into stunned silence. Karen, who moments ago looked like she was on the brink of collapse, now stood tall, her face lit with cruel satisfaction. A cold, triumphant smile spread across her lips like poison. She had flipped the entire situation. This was her trap, not mine. Bob stood beside her, looking smug, victorious. He had to be the one who filed the report. The officers advanced, their expressions unreadable, and I could feel the weight of 100 eyes bearing down on me. My neighbors, those who were rallying behind me seconds ago, now looked at me with uncertainty, confusion, even doubt. What is this about? I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady, though my heart pounded like a drum. We have a sworn statement from Mr. and Mrs. Miller, the officer said, nodding toward Karen and Bob. They claim you've been threatening them, attempting to extort them, and that these financial documents were fabricated to damage their reputation. Fabricated? The accusation hit me like a punch to the chest. She was accusing me of the very crime she had committed, and doing it with flawless timing. It was evil, brilliant, and executed with surgical precision. I had planned to destroy her in public, and now she was having me arrested in front of the entire neighborhood. My humiliation was complete. "This is insane," I shouted, turning to the stunned crowd. "She's the one who's been stealing from all of you. I have proof." The officer didn't flinch. "You can tell your story downtown," he said flatly, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Amanda rushed forward, eyes wide with panic. "You can't do this. He's the victim," she cried, grabbing my arm. The officer gently pushed her aside, and I felt the cold steel snap shut around my wrists. The click echoed like a gunshot in the stunned silence. Karen stood slowly, turning to address the room with icy authority. "As you can see," she said smoothly, "some individuals will go to desperate, criminal lengths when they don't get their way. The HOA will be pressing charges to the fullest extent of the law." Just like that, she had flipped the narrative completely. The hunter had become the hunted. The script had flipped entirely. I was no longer the determined hero, exposing the corrupt villain. I was now the villain in handcuffs, dragged out of the clubhouse under the glare of flashing red and blue lights. My carefully orchestrated plan had detonated in my face, leaving only humiliation in its wake. As the police led me to their cruiser, I could barely process the shock, but one thought echoed louder than the rest. How do I get out of this? How? Do you fight back when the person who controls everything has just branded you a criminal in front of your entire community? The backseat of a police car is a place of reflection and isolation. Through the rearview mirror, I saw the faces of my neighbors, some stunned, some horrified, others filled with pity, as they watched my walk of shame unfold in real time. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. At the station, I was processed like anyone else. They took my belt, my shoelaces, read me my rights for the second time, and left me alone in a small gray interrogation room that reeked of stale coffee, old sweat, and disinfectant. The charges were absurd: felony extortion and harassment. Karen and Bob had claimed I threatened to publish forged financial documents unless they paid me $50,000 and handed over the strip of land. It was a masterstroke of manipulation. They'd taken my 72-hour deadline, my angry ultimatum, even the spite fence, and twisted them into what now looked like a calculated criminal scheme. They weren't just lying, they were weaponizing the legal system against me. I knew I was innocent, but truth doesn't always win in court. A false accusation, if packaged well, can stick like tar. They had a sworn statement. I had a folder full of evidence they were now calling fake. It was their word against mine, and from the inside of that cold, windowless room, it felt like they were winning. After an hour, a detective walked in. He was a large man with a weary expression, the kind of face that had heard every story and believed very few. He dropped a slim folder onto the table, my file. "So," he said, sitting down with a sigh, "you want to tell me your side of the story?" I took a long breath, suppressing the white-hot rage boiling in my chest. Screaming wouldn't help me. The lawyer in me knew better. I had to be calm, clear, and convincing. And so I began, laying out everything piece by piece. The hose, the wreath, the stolen strip of land, the fake landscaping company, and yes, even the ugly fence that I told the detective everything about: the financial records, the shell company, and my plan to expose it all at the HOA meeting. I didn't raise my voice, didn't point fingers. I simply laid out the facts, one by one, as clearly and calmly as I could. He listened in silence, his eyes scanning my face, weighing every word, every pause. When I finished, he didn't respond right away. He just sat there for a long, quiet moment before finally speaking. "It's a good story," he said, almost like he meant it. "But you've got to admit, from where I'm sitting, it looks bad. You built a spite fence. You planned a public ambush. It walks like harassment, talks like harassment." "It wasn't harassment," I said, meeting his gaze. "It was fighting back. There's a difference." He shrugged, unmoved. "That's for the DA to decide. For now, you need to call your lawyer." And that's when the door opened. Amanda stepped inside, but she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was a short, sharply dressed woman with commanding eyes and a presence that filled the room like a thunderclap. "I'm Sarah Jenkins," she said, offering the detective a firm handshake. I'm Mr. Peterson's counsel. While I was being paraded out of the clubhouse, Amanda had made a call to my old law firm. Sarah Jenkins, a partner there, was one of the fiercest defense attorneys in the state. A legend, a shark. And Amanda had also thought to bring my briefcase, the one containing everything. Dossier A, and more importantly, Dossier B. Within an hour, Sarah had me released on my own recognizance. The charges weren't dropped, but I was out, and that meant I still had a chance. When we got back to my house, the street was lit up. Porch lights glowed like judgmental eyes, and I could feel my neighbors watching from behind curtains and half-closed blinds. I wasn't the neighborhood hero anymore. I was a pariah. Inside, I collapsed onto the couch, the weight of it all pressing down on me. She won. Amanda, I said bitterly. She beat me. But Amanda's voice cut through the defeat like steel. No, she didn't. She just made it personal. Now we fight back harder. Sarah flipped open my briefcase on the dining room table with the precision of someone about to perform surgery. Okay, Jack, she said, her tone briskened. Razor sharp. Show me everything. I walked her through it all again, piece by piece. The HOA bylaws, the absurd fine notices, the maze of financial statements. She listened without interruption, nodding, her eyes scanning every page like a hawk. Then I reached for the final file, Dossier B. This, I said, placing it in front of her, is what she doesn't know I have. I unrolled the copy of Vinny's original map, showed her the county property records, and explained the significance of the public easement, how Karen had illegally seized county-owned land and handed it over to her son. Sarah's eyes lit up as the pieces clicked into place. A slow, delighted smile crept across her face. Oh my, she murmured. Oh, this isn't just good, Jack. This is beautiful. She tapped the map with one manicured finger. The extortion charge? That's nothing but a smokescreen. A last-ditch move from a cornered animal. We can crush that. But this? She looked back at the map, her voice practically purring. This is the kill shot. And she was absolutely right. I had been so consumed with staging a public spectacle at the HOA meeting that I'd nearly forgotten the most devastating weapon in my arsenal. I'd been trying to win a neighborhood brawl, but the real war wasn't in that clubhouse. It was in court, with real laws and real consequences. And Karen, in her arrogance, had just handed me the opening I needed. By having me arrested, she didn't silence me. She gave me a legal platform to present every shred of evidence, under oath, in front of a judge. She'd pulled the trigger on what she thought was my end, but all she'd done was invite in a much bigger, more dangerous opponent. The game had changed. This wasn't about HOA votes or angry petitions anymore. This was about criminal charges, sworn depositions, subpoenas, and courtrooms. And we were done playing defense. Over the next 2 weeks, everything became a blur of legal motions, research, and preparation. Sarah Jenkins was relentless, a storm in heels and a tailored blazer. One of her first moves? Filing a powerful motion to dismiss the charges against me. And that was just the beginning. In one sweeping, powerful motion, she compiled and submitted every shred of evidence we had. Pristine lawns LLC's questionable. Financial records, sworn affidavits from other neighbors detailing Karen's ongoing harassment. And the centerpiece of it all, certified county maps and official documents that undeniably prove the illegal seizure of public land. But this wasn't just about defending my innocence anymore. This was a full-scale offensive, a formal legal accusation against Karen and Bob, laid out in a court filing with precision and intent. We didn't stop there. We fired copies off to the county commissioner's office and the district attorney's public integrity unit, making sure the truth echoed through every relevant institution. It was a coordinated strike, a calculated blaze meant to ignite change from every direction. The first flicker of progress came from Vinny, a neighbor who called me, breathless with excitement. Jack, there are men in suits at the lake, checking out the fence with those rolling measuring wheels. County surveyors had arrived, quietly verifying the claims we had made. Then came the HOA board meeting, scheduled for a Thursday night, which was supposed to be Karen's moment of triumph, a chance to solidify her control, paint me as a villain, and bully everyone else into submission. Sarah warned me to stay away. Let the lawyers handle it now, Jack. Don't walk into the crossfire. But I couldn't stay back. My temper, my pride, that instinct to defend myself, it wouldn't let me. I had to see her try to lie through her teeth with my own eyes. Amanda stood by me, resolute as ever. "We started this together," she said. "We'll finish it together." The moment we stepped into the clubhouse, the room dropped into a thick, charged silence. This wasn't the stunned silence of my arrest. It was heavier, full of suspense. Karen and Bob sat at the head table, but their expressions had changed. No longer smug, they looked uneasy and cornered. Karen opened the meeting with a voice, tight and strained, attempting to paint herself as a victim of a cruel conspiracy, but her words fell flat. The spell was broken. Too many people had already seen the leaked documents from Sarah's court filing, and the truth was finally louder than her lies. As whispers of the court filing continued circulating through the neighborhood, tension simmered at a near-boiling point, and then it happened. Right in the middle of Karen's theatrical speech about community integrity, the clubhouse doors swung open with purposeful weight. This time, it wasn't the police. It was two sharply dressed officials, a man and a woman, followed closely by Sarah, my lawyer, and Vinny, who looked like he'd just won the grand prize on a game show. The woman strode confidently to the front of the room, her presence commanding. "Karen Miller?" she asked, her voice steady and authoritative. Karen nodded slowly, her confusion plain for all to see. "I'm Elizabeth Cole from the district attorney's office, and this is Mark Chin from the county commissioner's office." The room collectively gasped, everyone realizing this was no longer a neighborhood squabble. This was the reckoning. "We're here," Cole continued, "to serve you with this." She handed Karen a thick envelope. "A cease and desist order regarding your illegal occupation of county-owned public land." Then she turned to Bob, delivering a second envelope. "And this is a subpoena for all HOA financial records and those of your personal business, Pristine Lawns LLC." Karen looked at the documents like they were venomous. Her face went ghostly pale. Bob's complexion shifted to a sickly shade, and he swayed slightly like he might faint. And then, just when we all thought the drama had peaked, Vinny stepped forward, practically shaking with excitement, holding up a small, crumpled piece of paper. "And I got something too," he blurted, but no one paid attention at first. Everyone was still locked on the unfolding fallout. "No, seriously," he insisted. "While the surveyor guys were out there, I noticed a patch of fresh dirt, so I poked around. And I found this." My heart skipped a beat. What the hell had he dug up? He held the paper higher. It was a receipt from a nearby storage facility, dated 6 months ago, and bearing Bob's name. It was for a 1-year rental, paid entirely in cash. At first glance, it didn't seem monumental, but Ms. Cole's instincts kicked in. She took the receipt from Vinny with quiet intensity, and in that instant, we all knew this story was far from over. She studied the receipt, then shifted her gaze to Bob with a look that turned razor-sharp, her professional curiosity now replaced by a piercing intensity. "Mr. Miller," she said, her tone suddenly like ice. "Why would you need a cash-paid storage unit when you already have a 2-car garage and a full basement?" Bob said nothing. He just began to sweat, his silence louder than any confession. I didn't know what exactly Vinny had uncovered, but deep in my gut, I felt it. This was no longer just about a shady landscaping scheme. This was something darker, something deeper, the kind of discovery that didn't just crack a foundation, but opened a sinkhole wide enough to devour everything around it. The room erupted into chaos. Karen lost control entirely, shrieking like a trapped animal. She pointed fingers in every direction, at Vinny, accusing him of fabricating evidence, at me, claiming I was behind some grand conspiracy, even at the DA's office, calling them my puppets. It was a jaw-dropping public breakdown, her composure disintegrating in real time. Meanwhile, Bob stood frozen, pale as chalk, his eyes darting toward the exit like a man already planning an escape. But Ms. Cole remained calm, unfazed by the theatrics. She quietly spoke into her phone, and just minutes later, 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies appeared, not for me this time, but as silent symbols of something far more serious. They didn't speak, just took their places by the door, making it crystal clear that this was now an active, escalating investigation. They gently escorted Bob outside, with Ms. Cole and the county official close behind. A crowd of homeowners followed, including me, Amanda, and Vinny, who looked like a proud detective fresh off a big break. Outside, Under the unforgiving glare of the clubhouse security lights, Miss Cole held the storage unit receipt up in the air like it was Exhibit A in a courtroom. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way, Bob," she said firmly. "We're getting a warrant either way. It'll be a lot better for you if you just tell us what's in there right now." Bob turned to look at Karen, who was now being restrained by one of the deputies, her face twisted in a storm of tears and fury. He then looked out at the sea of his neighbors, faces full of disbelief, disgust, and quiet judgment. Finally, he dropped his gaze to the ground, the last remnants of resistance draining from him. "It was Karen's idea," he mumbled, voice barely audible, but enough to change everything. His voice cracked under the weight of it all of it, he admitted, then spilled everything in a slow, unraveling confession that silenced the crowd. The landscaping scam had only scratched the surface. What they had really been running was far more dangerous, a corruption ring hiding in plain sight. Karen, leveraging her power as HOA president, had partnered with a crooked county building inspector. For hefty cash kickbacks, they approved unsafe, non-code construction projects for shady developers, falsifying permits and inspection reports to keep the money flowing. It wasn't just financial fraud, they were putting lives at risk, allowing structurally unsound buildings to go up across the county. Ms. Cole pressed him, her voice sharp. "Where are the records of these transactions?" Bob, trembling and defeated, pointed weakly at the storage unit receipt. "In there," he whispered. "Duplicate ledgers, cash, everything." It was the classic downfall of the greedy. He couldn't let go of the evidence, needed to keep it close, hoard it like a dragon with gold, and now it was going to crush him. As deputies led Bob to the patrol car, Karen let out one final, guttural wail, a sound of pure collapse. They turned back for her next. When the cuffs clicked around her wrists and our eyes met, there was nothing left in her expression. No arrogance, no fire, just a hollow stare of total ruin. Her reign didn't end with a petty neighborhood vote. It ended in handcuffs, flashing lights, and an avalanche of felony charges. Suddenly, my original thirst for revenge seemed small, insignificant compared to the festering rot we had uncovered. This wasn't about a fence or a stolen sliver of land anymore. It was about exposing corruption that had infected the very foundation of our county. The fallout was immediate, with Bob's confession and the mountain of evidence retrieved. From the storage unit, the district attorney had a case so airtight it practically sealed itself. Karen and Bob were charged with embezzlement, bribery, racketeering, and wire fraud. The dirty inspector was arrested the following day, and his name sent shockwaves through the county's offices. The HOA, now in complete disarray, was placed under court-ordered receivership with a temporary manager appointed to clean up the mess. And then, just like that, a special emergency election was called to rebuild from the ashes. And in a twist I never could have predicted, my neighbors, many of whom once watched silently from the sidelines, elected me as the new HOA president. I tried to refuse, feeling more like a reluctant warrior than a leader, but Mrs. Gable looked me in the eye and said firmly, "You're the only one we trust to burn the old kingdom down and build something fair." A few weeks later, Amanda and I sat on our back deck, the warm breeze carrying sounds of laughter and life. The ugly, petty spite fence was gone, torn down by a group of cheerful neighbors one sunny Saturday morning, their joy turning demolition into celebration. The once disputed strip of land now bore a new sign, freshly posted by the county, Public Lake Access Park. Children laughed and played where Kevin's tacky backyard party zone used to be, their energy a symbol of something finally made right. The community was healing, not just on the surface, but deeply. Neighbors were talking again, sharing meals, organizing barbecues, and rebuilding trust. We had regained our peace, but it wasn't the fragile peace of silence and avoidance. It was a hard-earned, resilient peace, one forged through conflict, accountability, and truth. As I gazed out across the calm water, I thought back to who I had been at the start of this journey. Angry, fueled by a desire to humiliate, to dismantle, to take revenge at any cost. But the road I walked led to something greater. This wasn't just about defending my name or my land. It was about exposing a rot that had endangered everyone, about reclaiming integrity for our entire neighborhood. My fire had nearly consumed me, had nearly burned too hot. But with Amanda's steady hand in mine, we redirected it, turned it into something that could shine light into the darkness. And in the soft hush of that peaceful evening, her hand, resting gently in mine, I knew without a doubt, we were finally, completely, truly free.